course, all of this is in the context of the issues China is having with its economy. I know you've been covering China's economy for a long time. Currently, it seems to be. Well, tell us, what do you think of the current state of the Chinese economy, and how will that affect China's global ambitions?
Yeah. China's economy is not growing at the 4.6% pace that Beijing reported for the third quarter of this year. It could be growing at 0.5%. It could be at zero. It could be contracting. But even if it were growing at 4.6, it's not growing fast enough to pay back debt. China incurred very large amounts of debt, especially after 2008, because they didn't want a downturn then. So they embarked on the biggest stimulus program in history. And now they're having their 2008, Chris. So they're in a point where there are no solutions. Just to give you an example, in September of last year, a former senior statistics official in China reported that there were enough vacant apartments in China to house the entire population of 1.4 billion people. And at the time, he said that there was some dispute at that figure because some people thought that China had enough vacant apartments for 3 billion people. So there are no solutions to these problems. And it means that ultimately there's going to be a reckoning in China. I think this is really dangerous because it means that Xi Jinping may not be reacting to external pressure. I mean, he may not be deterred. He may be reacting either solely or almost solely to domestic incentives to go to war. Remember, this is a guy who has a very low threshold of risk. He inherited a political system in 2012, which was consensual. No Chinese leader got too much credit or too much blame because decisions were shared across the political system. This is a guy who, by grabbing power from everybody else, has grabbed total accountability. And he's also raised the cost of losing political struggles. So he's now being blamed for China's economic problems, and he's responsible for them. Almost every economist will have already told him he needs to make consumption to be the basis of the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping won't do that for various reasons, most of them ideological. And that means his only way out is to export. That's the only way to rescue this situation. And he's finding that the United States and others, EU, and even global South countries are starting to restrict imports of Chinese products, which means this guy is desperate, which means that he could take us by surprise because he may think that his only way out is to kill a lot of foreigners.
What would that achieve for his power, though? Like wars are expensive to launch.
Require a lot of manpower, which they don't have.
Right. And, they're running out of young people demographically. And I guess I don't understand from Xi Jinping's perspective, what is how a war to, for example, take Taiwan or to hurt some other country, what would that achieve for his power and his economy?
It would prevent other senior Communist Party figures from challenging or deposing him. This is what Mao did by starting the Cultural Revolution. This was an attempt on the part of Mao to prevent others from taking power from him. And I mentioned Xi Jinping reveres Mao, is adopting his tactics. He could very well decide to do the same thing. Now, I agree with you, Matt, that starting a war isn't in China's interest, but it is in Xi Jinping's interest. And, people may say, and it's obviously true, that if Xi Jinping started a war, that he would have maybe a very low chance of success. Let's say it's 10% for sake of argument. But, and of course, we look at that and we say, oh, nobody would start a war if they have only a 10% chance of success. Well, no. If you're Xi Jinping and you realize you have total accountability for the unfolding disasters in China, and you know that if you are taken out of power, you will be imprisoned, you will be stripped of assets, you could lose your life, your family will be in prison. And if you think that that's like a near certain chance, then a 10% chance of prevailing looks pretty good. it looks very good. It looks a lot better than a 0.5% chance of living. So yeah, he can do all sorts of things that can take us by surprise. And I know that that sounds inconceivable to most ears, but the point is we got to look at this from Xi Jinping's perspective himself. He can't solve China's problems. He's being blamed for China's problems. He knows he can lose everything because of this. So if he believes that his only way out is to start a war, then I think that he could very well decide to do that. Because if he starts a war, he prevents other senior leaders from taking him out. And that's what he cares about.
Right. Well, you know, when Mao, because you brought up the Cultural Revolution, Mao's Cultural Revolution was essentially Mao building up this cult of personality to get the Chinese people on his side. And, you know, the reason that people were made to wave all these, you know, little red books and, you know, study Mao Zedong thought. And you even have to say a Mao Zedong quote just to get on a public bus. You know, this just a craze of we love Mao Zedong, right? And that is what elevated Mao's power compared to the power of those other officials who wanted to get rid of him. But there's a difference between that and then starting an external war, because wouldn't an external war potentially be very unpopular among Chinese citizens and therefore actually hurt Xi Jinping's chances of staying in power?
Well, that's very perceptive. Yes, a war would be extremely unpopular. But if Xi Jinping believes that because of his control mechanisms that they can't do anything, then starting a war doesn't, you know, he doesn't care what the Chinese people will do. You know, since you raised the topic, I think, you know, we should talk about it, and that is that the Chinese people don't want war. Clearly, they don't want war. They're a very gloomy people right now, and they're not about to lose their only son or daughter in you know, some military misadventure abroad. And since we've been talking about Taiwan, we should mention that as well. The Chinese people don't want war. They certainly don't want a war with Taiwan. People in Taiwan don't think they're Chinese. We know this from self-identification surveys, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the people in China think that the people in Taiwan are Chinese, and that's because of decades of indoctrination. And the Chinese people will tell you, you'll hear this on the street, you'll hear this from officials, that Chinese don't kill Chinese. So going out and starting a war on Taiwan, killing hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Taiwanese, very, very unpopular. But remember, Xi Jinping, if he believes that the popular Chinese opinion doesn't count because he can control them, if he's desperate, he can do anything. We've got to put ourselves in his shoes, look at the world from his perspective, because I think the world from his perspective is very different than the world from our perspective. Xi Jinping has staked his legitimacy on annexing Taiwan. And I think that he will go to great lengths to do something about it. I hope he doesn't. You know, he could very well start a war someplace else. But the point is, we've got to be concerned about the way he looks at the world, not the way we look at the world.
I do think it's interesting that he may be learning some things also from what Russia is doing, like the Russia-Ukraine war. Because, you know, the Russian people, even if it may be unpopular in some ways, there's still a certain amount of popular support for what's happening with Ukraine. And I think what happens a lot with this indoctrination, the nationalism that you grow up with, you know, from the time that you enter school in China, is that you don't have a good idea of what the reality is in the situation in Taiwan. Like, I think a lot of Chinese people don't understand that Taiwanese people do not want to be a part of China, and don't understand that this war could be long and protracted. And, you know, like, these are people who are still, you know, what is the popular, you know, movies in China and things like that, still anti-Japanese movies about World War II. So there's a lot of, I think, people who don't understand what the cost of the war would be. And I think for Xi Jinping, it might not be that big of a risk, at least up front, until the reality of the situation sinks in, that it's not just one of those when people got into World War I, both sides thought they'd be home for Christmas, that kind of thing. So I think that it's very possible that Chinese people don't understand what the actual cost and realities of an invasion of Taiwan would be.
I'm sure that's the case. There are all sorts of things, and Shelley, you're absolutely right. A war with Japan would be far more popular because there's been a lot of indoctrination. Mao and Deng Xiaoping were sure of their legitimacy, and they had cordial relations with Tokyo. It was only when you start to get to Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping that you have this malicious indoctrination, which, I grew up in a Chinese household. I didn't grow up in the mainland, grew up in America. And I heard the stories of my dad, who didn't suffer too much in World War II, a little bit, but that has always stayed with me. So you can imagine what it's like if you're actually in the People's Republic and hearing this stuff day in, day out. And that's why, we see China with these very belligerent military activities against Taiwan, flying a plane through Japanese territorial airspace, all of these incursions in Japanese territorial waters around the islands that the Japanese call the Senkakus and the Chinese call the Diaoyus. And also, when, on this broader topic of what Xi Jinping is doing, these very belligerent activities in the South China Sea against the Philippines. So you have China lashing out. And the headlines from the last couple of weeks is, you have these Chinese patrols in Indonesian waters. So this is crazy. This is strategic incoherence on the part of the Chinese, which is a real warning sign about things. Whatever you say about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, it hasn't worked out the way Putin thought it would. But the means that he employed were directly related to the ends that he wanted. He wanted to annex Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine. That makes sense. What Xi Jinping is doing is he's creating a lot of unhappiness in the region, and he's not accomplishing anything. He is getting the region to seek the help of the United States. He's getting the region to seek help among countries in the region, or looking at other countries in the region. So this is counterproductive Chinese foreign policy. It is incoherence. And it says something is really, really wrong in the Chinese political system right now. And that's another reason why this guy can take us by surprise.
Right. Well, one of the things that Mao did was, and you mentioned this in your book, is his strategy in the civil war that the communists launched against the government of China at the time was using the countryside to encircle the cities, right?
Yes.
Does that apply perhaps to what Xi Jinping's doing in the South China Sea and with those countries, even if it's not obvious?
Yes, I think he is. Except that in now what he's doing is he's using Ukraine, North Africa, Middle East, South China Sea. He's thinking those are the countryside and we're the city.
You're saying we, America, are the city, and he's encircling America by using proxy wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, and so on.
Exactly.
Let's start to wrap this up with the idea that you think the U.S. should sever all ties to China, what gets called decoupling. A lot of people think that's just not even possible. That China owns U.S. debt. They call that we're screwed. What is it realistic to assume that the U.S. can just completely decouple from China? And do you think the Trump administration would do that?
I think that it can be done. Remember, we decoupled from China one time, when Mao took over. And we will decouple if China kills American servicemen or women. We'll do that very fast. We can just see what we have done in the past. In the absence of the killing of American military personnel, no, we're not going to do that. But my point is that's necessary. And when in times when what is necessary is not considered to be politically acceptable, they're always followed by great tragedy. I'd like to prevent great tragedy. So we're going to have to do extraordinary things. If we're not, we're going to take great losses. And we're going to have those losses are not going to be just military, it's going to be civilians as well. In the next war, there won't be a distinction between military and civilians. You know, the Chinese kill 70 to 75,000 Americans each year with doses of illicit Chinese fentanyl. These are not just killings, these are murders. The fentanyl gangs in China, they're large, they're well organized, they're international in scope. They could not operate in China's near total surveillance state without the approval and the knowledge of the Communist Party. Some of these fentanyl producers are state-owned. We know that Chinese diplomats give cover to the gangs. We know that every container that leaves China is inspected by Chinese officials. The Chinese fentanyl gangs, they launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. China's own TikTok, which it uses to propagate its narratives, promotes illicit drug use in the US. China is murdering 70 to 75,000 Americans a year. We have got to do something.
It even ties into what you were saying earlier that, internationally, China's become the money launderers for all kinds of drug cartels, criminal organizations. And a lot of that, as you said, is getting laundered right through New York City.
Yes. Every transaction that a bank conducts in dollars, other than with paper currency, has to clear in New York City. That means they got to clear through a US correspondent bank. And the reason why the Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act is so powerful is because it disconnects banks that are of primary money laundering concern from their correspondents. It means they can't conduct any transactions in dollars anywhere in the world other than physical currency.